It's neither surprising nor coincidental that the current ascent of the police state in Western democracies is happening in countries where the people are largely unarmed, nor is it surprising that the ideological movement that claims to want sensible gun control is led by a demographic that is increasingly anti-free speech and increasingly anti-constitution. The right to protect true freedom has always been inextricably linked to the right to protect one's freedoms with weapons that represent a proper challenge to both tyrannical government forces and tyrannical mob forces that seek to violate the sacred rights of individuals. History is filled with examples of atrocities being committed against unarmed people, and often the confiscation of weapons is a precursor to horrendous events or periods of oppression. Those of us who understand the relationship between freedom and the right to bear arms cannot help but wonder how differently history would have unfolded in so many evil and oppressive circumstances had the people who were victimized been armed and willing to use those weapons. History certainly gives us many examples of armed people resisting tyranny. During the American Revolution, outnumbered colonial Americans were emboldened to fight against the British regime because they had guns and resisted British attempts to seize their weapons. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, black civil rights leaders advocated lawful gun ownership as a means for blacks to protect themselves against Klan terrorism and police brutality. During the LA riots of 1992, Korean Americans defended their businesses and their people with semi-automatic rifles and pistols. An effective weapon is one that can deter both mob forces and government forces from undue aggression and tyranny over individuals. In many cases, an authoritarian mob and the government work hand in hand to achieve dominance over their political enemies. Such was the case with the Klan and law enforcement in the Jim Crow South. Such is the case currently with Tommy Robinson, a UK native who has been a vocal critic of Muslim rape gangs in England. Robinson has been hounded and beaten by anti-fascist and migrant thugs and has received no protection from the police. In fact, it could be argued that Robinson has been targeted by the police, as he was arrested and imprisoned for what many say were transparently bogus reasons. While he was in prison, he was allegedly targeted again by violent migrant criminals. To be clear, Tommy Robinson is not a popular person amongst UK mainstream culture. He has been labeled a racist, and he has likely offended the sensibilities of Brits who would rather wash their hands of men with baldly working-class accents who speak frankly about racially charged issues, like migrant men raping and trafficking young white girls. But Robinson's offensiveness or popularity is not the issue here. The issue is that in a country where no one is willing to defend Tommy Robinson, he has no means to defend himself. Police officers standing down or refusing to protect individuals when the mob enacts its own tyranny is effectively the same as government forces enacting tyranny against individuals. Tommy Robinson may not have the same legal free speech protections that we have here in the United States, but he presumably has legal protections against assault and terrorist-style stalking and harassment. But as was the case with the Jim Crow South, those legal protections are useless in a nation where law enforcement is willing to protect certain groups of individuals and not others. The same is true, of course, for the women and girls that Robinson seeks to defend. In cities where young girls were raped and trafficked for decades, the police failed to protect these children for fear of being seen as racist. The families had no means to protect their own children because it was against the law for them to have weapons. Again, it doesn't matter that it is illegal to rape and traffic children in a country where that law is not enforced or is enforced unequally. It's also important to understand that the refusal of government authorities to protect certain classes of people is a pattern that has repeated itself over and over throughout modern history. Once you begin to see this pattern, you notice its prevalence in so-called Western democracies, these emancipated cultures where all individuals, regardless of race, class, gender, or religious background, are allegedly afforded equal rights by the law. What this pattern of unequal law enforcement creates is what YouTuber Black Pigeon Speaks identifies as Anarcho-Tyranny, a dynamic in which certain protected classes of people are allowed to tyrannize other classes of people in ways that benefit elite powers that wish to subvert the rule of law. In Germany, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia, the classes of people who are regularly subjected to this kind of tyranny include Jews, Muslim apostates, women and girls, especially those women and girls who wear Western clothes or go out in public alone, and pro-borders nationalists. The protected classes who are allowed to terrorize these unprotected groups include Muslim migrants and violent leftist anti-fascist groups. Similar dynamics are at play here in the United States, but with an important distinction. We have seen numerous conservative speaking events where violent leftist mobs have attacked pro-borders conservatives and Trump supporters and have often shut down their events. Over the years, the groups who have been aggressive and also been protected include anti-fascist, Mexican nationalists, and Black Lives Matter. The groups being attacked include anyone who supports free speech or limiting immigration, from centrist classical liberals and libertarian conservatives to a small minority of white supremacists who are shunned by the former two groups. As is the case in Europe, the police or security frequently stood by while the aggressors did their work, and the media either ignored or severely underreported the aggression. But the difference between this type of threat in Europe and in the United States is that here in the U.S., the leftist aggression is generally limited to public events at gun-free zones, where those targeted are known to be unarmed. Leftists here in the United States are less willing to take their violence to the homes and businesses of people who have weapons in their houses and pocketbooks and are willing to use them. In Europe, however, story after story tells us of people who live in fear, people who are beaten, raped, or stalked, and who are virtually unprotected by police, and whose perpetrators are largely ignored or exonerated by law enforcement. But you won't hear about those stories if you only watch mainstream media, as the classes of people who are protected by police are also protected by the media establishments. This double layer of protection for certain classes creates a double layer of vulnerability for the unprotected classes, who are often portrayed as aggressors by propagandized media outlets. The unprotected group has no help from law enforcement, and in countries where there are hate speech laws, they have no way of informing the public of their victimization, not even through alternative media channels, because it is likely illegal to criticize certain groups of people. Consider the story of the Swedish woman whose experiences were posted by a videographer named Peter from Sweden. She was badly beaten by migrants and claims that the police did nothing to protect her or punish those who attacked her. The media won't cover her story because it's taboo to acknowledge migrant violence there, and when she began publicly speaking out about Islamic extremism, she was harassed and interrogated by the police. Even if this woman did have a gun to defend herself from these attackers, she would have been jailed for using it. It's against the law to use a gun for self-defense in Sweden. When a society is not willing to protect its own women and children, and when its people are not allowed to defend themselves, something is clearly broken. And there is no hope for that brokenness to be fixed when the people are in denial about what's happening. Mainstream Swedes, Brits, and Germans are proud of their allegedly democratic governments. They are proud of the fact that they live in emancipated cultures. They are proud of their cultural tolerance and their peacefulness. They are proud of the fact that they don't have the levels of gun ownership or gun violence that exist in the United States. But they are clearly in denial about the level of authoritarianism that is being practiced by their own governments. This tendency to deny the reality or possibility of government authoritarianism is why so many are comfortable with disarmament. Few who believe they live in a free society are willing to believe it's possible for their own government to betray them on such a deep level as is happening in so much of Europe, especially when that betrayal is being masked by media propaganda. People who have a delusional belief that their government will always protect them and will never harm them or turn against them do not see a problem with being disarmed. This kind of naivete is obviously prevalent in the United States as well, but with some important distinctions. Amongst those who agree that banning guns or repealing the Second Amendment is a good idea, There is a willingness to believe that somehow a government that has repeatedly targeted or failed to protect certain groups of people throughout history will somehow magically begin doing better when law-abiding citizens are disarmed. What's so frustrating to me about this dynamic is that a large percentage of Black Americans, for obvious reasons, have a greater distrust of law enforcement than white Americans do. This natural distrust of authority, which I would argue is healthy in a free society, is an impulse that is being channeled by leftist groups into a push for greater authoritarianism. The idea that these leftist groups are pushing is that the Second Amendment, which admittedly has a history of unequal enforcement, is still enforced unequally, and that it therefore serves to protect the status of white people as the dominant elite in a racist society. Whether or not this disparity still exists, what's stunning about this propaganda narrative is that it is a complete reversal from the message of self-empowerment that was taught by civil rights leaders of the past. I highly recommend 2 videos about guns in the civil rights movement. One is this speech by Charles Cobb, who was involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s South, and who argues that the civil rights movement would not have been possible without guns. He also wrote the book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, and he has some harrowing stories to tell about why guns were necessary during that time. I also recommend the second video in Tree of Logic series, Proof That Liberals Are Racist, #NotAll, which highlights the pro-gun, pro-constitution attitude of historic civil rights leaders in comparison to the anti-gun, anti-constitution attitude of current groups like Black Lives Matter. Leaders like Malcolm X were well aware of the unequal treatment of Black people, but they sought to legally arm Black people in order to address this power differential, not to disarm white people. They also sought to arm Black people with knowledge about their constitutional rights as American citizens. They didn't seek to diminish the rights of those who were more privileged as some kind of misguided idea that striving for mutual helplessness was the best way to strive for equality. The more I learn about the corruption of my own government agencies, the more I am relieved to know that the American people are well armed and that we have a unique culture of self-reliance here that is truly exceptional among Western democracies. That self-reliant spirit continues to thrive despite the dominance of Marxist groupthink in our university and media environments. And while a similarly independent spirit is growing in Europe, it's hard to say what the outcome will be for these people who are pushing against increasingly authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, mainstream Europeans continue to believe that they live in a free and enlightened cultures and that the American love of guns is a barbaric love of violence. They don't understand that for constitutional conservatives, our strident gun advocacy is not rooted in violence, but in an intrinsic understanding of how power corrupts when it becomes too centralized. Our prolific gun ownership represents a significant check against both government agencies and authoritarian extremists who constantly seek to encroach upon our human rights. Our AR-15s may be pea shooters compared to the weapons our government has, but there is a long history of men with pea shooters overcoming impossible odds. So I am not bothered by those of you who say that people like me support the killing of children, that we have blood on our hands, that looking at us is like looking down the barrel of a gun. Your words have no power over me, and you will not stop me from defending the rights of those who you would render helpless, including yourselves. I will not support the indoctrination and disarmament of our young people, no matter how much they attempt to bully me into doing so. They are marching in defense of their own enslavement, and I will not be a party to it. And I will not respond to tragedy by enabling a delusional belief that we must choose the safety of tyranny over the slaughter of innocents. Anybody that tells you such a choice is our only choice is lying to you, even if they believe their own lies. And any government that tells you that the American people are incapable of defending themselves and their children is also lying to you. These lies are as old as tyranny itself. We absolutely have the means to protect ourselves if the government would get out of the way, and I will never consent to teaching children that being helpless makes them safer. All right, everyone, God bless and have a beautiful day.